They said it was just dirt, a handful of dark, dry earth. No sparkle, no shine, just the same soil our grandfathers walked on barefoot, unaware of the empire it carried beneath. But the day I held that piece of earth in my hand, standing beside Prime Minister Modi, with cameras flashing and the air thick with diplomacy, I knew. This wasn't soil. It was sovereignty. It was the future. Buried beneath Africa's feet are 17 rare earth elements with names most people cannot pronounce, yet without which the world cannot function. Neodymium for electric motors, europium for TV screens, dysprosium for missile guidance, terbium for clean energy tech, the bones and blood of every smartphone, electric car, wind turbine, and satellite. For decades, we dug them up and shipped them away, raw, cheap, and invisible. China turned them into value. The West turned a blind eye. And Africa stayed in the dark until now. With one signature, $42 billion on the table, Burkina Faso said enough. This deal with India wasn't just about minerals, it was about memory, power, and a new industrial map. No longer just extractors, we are becoming processors, manufacturers, innovators, and the world noticed. Not with applause, but with anxiety. Because if Africa learns to refine what lies beneath, then who truly controls tomorrow? That's not a question for economists. It's a question for all of us. And if you're someone who's tired of being told what to think, if you're ready to hear the stories behind the headlines, the truths they'd rather you miss, then you've found the right place. Subscribe to the channel. Stay with us, because the next few minutes might just change the way you see Africa and the world. So let me ask you this. Who really owns the future? The one who digs the earth, the one who refines it, or the one who finally refuses to be silent? $42 billion for rocks. What India knows that the West missed. $42 billion. That was the number whispered in diplomatic backrooms before the announcement. Too big to be real. Too bold to be African. Yet there it was, in black ink and firm handshake, signed on soil the world once ignored. India didn't just show up with checkbooks. They came with blueprints. This was not charity. It was chess. $15 billion for rare earth processing facilities across Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. Not foreign-built factories run by expats. No, these are African-led, African-staffed, Indian-trained. $10 billion for permanent magnet production, the kind that powers electric vehicles, wind turbines, military radar. China built this empire quietly over 3 decades. India, they're building Africa's in 5. $8 billion for circuit board manufacturing, components once exclusively imported, now made from our own refined minerals. $5 billion to build technical universities, not just classrooms, but labs. Not just professors, but inventors. Degrees in rare earth chemistry, precision metallurgy, strategic materials engineering, fields China guarded like state secrets. And then $4 billion for defense-grade production, military electronics, missile guidance systems, encrypted communication tech, all sourced from minerals under African feet, refined in African soil, assembled by African hands. This was not a mining contract. It was an industrial master plan. But why now? Why would India, world's 5th largest economy, risk confrontation with China, provoke the West, and invest this heavily in a region most still call unstable? Because they see what others refuse to admit. The future is magnetic. Every electric car needs neodymium magnets. Every drone, every missile, every wind turbine. These magnets don't just move energy, they shift power. And power, real geopolitical power, comes from controlling what others need and cannot substitute. China knew this early. That's why they dominate 90% of global rare earth processing. Not mining, processing. The part with patents, pricing, and leverage. But China made one mistake. They assumed no one else could replicate the model. They bet that Africa would always sell the dirt and buy back the gold. They never expected Burkina Faso to sign the paper that would end their monopoly. Now India gets secure access to critical minerals. Africa gets industrial sovereignty. And the West is watching, silently, nervously, realizing it may be too late to catch up. And you, the viewer, ask yourself this: if the poorest nations start owning the most powerful materials, who's really poor? When the earth talks back, what happens when Africa says no? His name is Salif. He used to sit by the roadside, watching convoys of Chinese trucks haul away tons of soil from the hills outside his village. Every evening, he'd ask his father, "What's inside those rocks?" His father would shrug. Rich people's business. But now, Salif is no longer just watching. He's studying rare earth chemistry at a newly built technical college in Dori, funded by the same $42 billion deal. Next year, he'll be helping operate the processing plant rising from the same land those trucks once emptied. The trucks will still come, but this time, Salif will be the one sending them out. And the rocks, now refined, now priced in billions, not pennies. 100 miles away, in Fadang Gurma, an old woman named Aisha remembers when they said her village was sitting on useless hills. Foreign companies came and left, taking samples, making promises, and vanishing. But nothing ever changed. Until this. Now her grandchildren have jobs. The clinic has electricity. The school has real desks. Roads are being paved. Aisha doesn't know the names of the elements, but she knows what change feels like. And it feels like this. Meanwhile, in Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo, silence gave way to panic. Emergency briefings, defense departments scrambling for alternatives, tech executives calling emergency meetings, because they know the global clean energy transition, the future of AI warfare, the price of the next iPhone, it all depends on minerals they do not control anymore. Delegations flew to Ouagadougou with offers in hand, trade deals, aid packages, military cooperation. But every one of them came with conditions: environmental regulations, labor compliance, democratic benchmarks. And, for the first time, Africa didn't say yes. Instead, it said, "We'll listen, but we choose our terms now." That terrified them more than any weapon. Because what happens when the continent the world ignored decides it doesn't need permission anymore? What happens when the earth, so long dug in silence, finally talks back? You don't need missiles to shift power. Sometimes, all it takes is a pen, a mine, and the courage to say, "No more." And in that moment, when Burkina Faso stood firm, the rest of the world realized something far more dangerous than an uprising was unfolding. Africa wasn't rebelling. It was leading. The empire beneath, when soil becomes power. In Burkina Faso, there is no gold rush. There is no frenzy, no chaos, no wild speculation. There is something far more powerful: order. The kind of order that comes when a nation finally knows what it's worth. It began quietly. Children walking to school on paved roads instead of dirt paths. Clinics with stable electricity. Clean water running through pipes for the first time in villages once forgotten by maps. But beneath those surface changes, something deeper shifted. For decades, the political narrative in Africa was survival. Leaders managed poverty. They negotiated scraps. They balanced foreign interests like circus performers on a burning rope. But now, something extraordinary is happening. Governments are planning. not for famine relief, but for industrial expansion, not for foreign aid, but for domestic investment, not for debt relief, but for technological autonomy. Ministries that once dealt in paperwork and donor reports are now issuing contracts for high-tech infrastructure. Political debates are shifting from how do we get help to how do we control our market. In villages like Jibo and Gawa, community councils are forming, real governance, not imposed from above, but emerging from the ground. Local elders and young engineers sit at the same tables, planning how profits will be distributed, how lands will be protected, how future generations will be educated. And for the first time, rural communities are seeing real leverage. Because when the world needs what's beneath your feet, you stop begging. You start bargaining. The political class is evolving. Old power brokers, those who survived by playing East against West, are losing relevance. A new generation of technocratic leaders, engineers, mineral economists, and civic organizers are rising. Their language is different. Their loyalty is not to ideology, but to results. And yet, this rise comes with resistance. Some elites, threatened by transparency, are trying to stall reforms. Foreign lobbyists whisper behind closed doors, offering incentives to keep raw exports flowing. Corporate media outlets begin to shift tone, painting African independence not as progress, but as instability. But the people remember. They remember the years of extraction with nothing in return. They remember being told that development would come someday. They remember being lied to. And now, they can see the difference. When a village gets power from a local rare earth facility, children no longer do homework by candlelight. When roads are paved not by World Bank loans but by mineral profits, suddenly, they lead somewhere. When students in Ouagadougou study engineering in a campus funded by minerals once sold for pennies, identity shifts, pride returns, the land becomes sacred. This is no longer about economics. It's about dignity. It's about owning not just what you dig, but what you become because of it. And when dignity returns to a people, politics follows. The silent panic. What Washington saw in Ouagadougou. In a classified Pentagon briefing, a general circled one word on the screen: Ouagadougou. Not Beijing, not Moscow, not Tehran, Burkina Faso. It wasn't about troops. It wasn't about terror cells. It was about minerals, rare earth elements now refined on African soil, under African control, and outside Chinese leverage. The United States, long dependent on imported rare earths, suddenly faced a chilling reality. The future of its green economy, its weapons systems, even its smartphone supply chains, now hinged on African decisions. And those decisions were no longer filtered through foreign-owned corporations or predictable regimes. They were coming from a continent asking uncomfortable questions. Why does the West only show up when others do? Why is African sovereignty a threat, but Chinese monopoly a business strategy? Why do they praise democracy but panic when it produces independence? In Washington, diplomats rush to propose partnerships, renewables, trade corridors, research exchanges. But behind the polished language was anxiety, because for the first time in decades, Africa was not asking. It was offering and negotiating. And not just with America. Europe, facing its own energy crisis and desperate to catch up on EV production, saw Africa's industrial rise as both opportunity and competition. Suddenly, French, German, and Scandinavian ministers were lining up in Ouagadougou, offering clean development deals, most of them a decade too late. Meanwhile, in Beijing, unease turned into urgency. China had spent 30 years mastering the rare earth game, buying raw, refining fast, dominating quietly. They built the infrastructure, trained the engineers, controlled the patents. But what they didn't build was loyalty. Now, as Africa leans east, but not toward China, Beijing scrambles to regain ground. In boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Seoul, executives are recalculating risk. Who controls your magnets, your capacitors, your drone materials? It used to be simple. Now, they need to fly to Burkina Faso to find out. And in that quiet shift, in that recalibration of power, the unspoken fear becomes clear. What if Africa no longer needs permission? What if Washington missed the revolution, not in the streets, but in the soil? Africa 2044. What happens when the soil wins? Close your eyes. Picture Africa in 2044, not the Africa from charity ads, not the newsreels of war or famine, but an Africa where industrial plants hum from Dar es Salaam to Dakar. Where the phrase "made in Africa" no longer means raw exports, but high-tech goods, smartphones, electric cars, aerospace components. Where African universities don't send their best students abroad, they attract the world's brightest to come learn here. This isn't fantasy. It's blueprints already in motion. The Africa-India Rare Earth Corridor is not just a deal. It's a domino. It sets a precedent, one that can ripple from cobalt in Congo to lithium in Ghana, from tantalum in Rwanda to phosphate in Senegal. And as more nations move from digging to building, a new alliance emerges. Not a military bloc, not an economic dependency, but a union forged in self-respect, the League of Producers. Together, they control the 21st century's most critical supply chains. Together, they speak not from the margins, but from the center of global power. But this future is not guaranteed. It demands resolve. Corruption will fight back. Foreign powers will seek to divide. Old colonial patterns will disguise themselves in new partnerships. So the road forward is not paved with comfort. It is paved with courage. But we've already taken the first step. And once you start walking with your eyes open, you don't go back. Africa's future isn't buried beneath the soil anymore. It's being forged from it. And for those watching from Washington, Brussels, or Beijing, one question remains. When Africa stops digging for others and starts building for itself, who really owns the future? Not just rocks. The day Africa buried colonialism. The cameras are gone. The ink is dry. The soil still clings to the boots of the engineers. But history has already shifted. This was not just a trade deal. It was the day Africa buried a centuries-old system, one that mined our future and sold it for parts. We used to be maps on someone else's wall. Now we are the blueprint. We used to send ships filled with raw wealth and empty promises. Now we send terms. We used to study foreign languages to beg for aid. Now the world studies our minerals to beg for access. What happens when a continent stops being a source and becomes a center? When the world's supply chains run through African cities, African ports, African policies? It is no longer the age of empires. It is the age of equations. And Africa holds the variables. Every electric car, every solar panel, every drone, every phone, connected to something buried beneath our land. For centuries, we were told it was just dirt. But this dirt rewrites global power. So, what comes next? Will other nations follow Burkina Faso's lead? Will Congo hold the line on cobalt? Will Ghana turn lithium into leverage? Will the West learn to negotiate, not dictate? Or will they resist to the bitter end? Because what began with a $42 billion deal could end with the collapse of an old world order, one where Africa was used, not heard. That order is crumbling, and something else is rising in its place. Not just factories, not just refineries, but sovereignty. And if you believe that matters, if you believe the world's center of gravity is shifting, then you need to see what comes next, because this rare earth revolution is only the beginning. Subscribe, stay awake, and remember, the soil beneath your feet is speaking. Long before the world knew their names, before Tesla, before Apple, before Huawei, there were African miners with bare hands and broken backs. They dug for coltan without knowing it powered satellites. They sifted for tungsten, not realizing it guided missiles. They pulled up Earth, thinking it was survival, never knowing it was supremacy. They were nameless, faceless, forgotten. Their pain was paved over with tech profits. Their silence was sold in bulk, labeled as development. But now, the silence is cracking. Now, the very materials that made others rich are making Africa conscious. We are remembering. We are remembering that before rare earths had labels, our elders had knowledge that metallurgy, chemistry, trade, these were not imported concepts. Timbuktu held libraries while Europe still burned witches. Great Zimbabwe rose in stone while London was mud. They buried our genius beneath colonial maps. Now we are excavating truth, not just minerals. And the deeper we dig, the more we find this revolution is not just economic, it is spiritual. Because to control your soil is to reclaim your soul. That's what the West never expected. They thought we would sell rocks, but we are reassembling ourselves. With every factory we